This is not one of my typical comedy or funny children's type stories. It's a little more serious. I just say that in the very beginning to give you a heads up. At the very end, I'll give some interesting background as to where the inspiration for this story came from. The story is completely fictional, but there are some facts about scientific discoveries I ran with while writing this. Also, in the description under the video, there'll be links to some other stories that are a lot more lighthearted and funny and about kids and stuff like that. But again, this one's a little more serious, and if you don't like spiders too much, you may not want to listen to this one uh, because it does describe some spiders in it, but it's not horror or scary really by any means. Um, and if you can't stand spiders but you're interested in some health facts that inspired this story, then you can go to my blog, which will be listed down below in the description as well. And at the very bottom under extras, you can just read that section there. The story is called Bite to the Bone. It's a short story about a scientist who discovers that mixing spider webs with tiny glass beads create some new material used to grow and repair human bones. Here we go. Bite to the bone. Steve was sitting in the dark movie theater when he felt a little prick on the back of his neck. He let out a little yo! His girlfriend Jill slapped his thigh. He raised his hand to touch the painful area. Something bit me, he tried to whisper. He began to moan. His girlfriend tried once again to get him to hush. Steve became weak and broke out into a cold sweat. I'm really sick. He was still trying to keep his voice down. What? She replied. No, really, I'm sick. He grabbed her hand and she felt his clammy skin. Are you okay? She began to become more aware of him and forget about the movie. No, is the only word that he could get out. Let's get out of here, Steve. She escorted him out of the theater. 72 hours later, Steve died. 6 days earlier, we have the test results, Dr. Monroe, Steve, the youngest lab assistant, said as he handed the doctor some report papers. Did you come to a conclusion with the microscopic fusion? Yes, sir. Steve could read the headlines now. Monroe and his assistants find cure for bone marrow complications. The young Dr. Monroe spoke into a handheld tape recorder. Possible finalization of phase phase 1 specimen P762 .536. Studies show the fusion of ground up glass silica .45277 grain mixture with silk webbing material from lab insect 774.337, aka what we've been calling the gray-black spider. We confirm, according to our controlled environment study, that synthetic bone is formed as a result of fusing the above said materials. The doctor turned the tape off, then gave his assistants specific directions. Okay, now look, seal that experimental study, and soon we can move on into the next phase, breeding. But do not do anything or set anything into place until we get the approval of the board. I also want to check a few things to find out why and how only this spider produces the right material. Keep them all separated, all of them. Steve questioned, all of them? Even the same species? Dr. Monroe verified, yes, all of them. All species and all male and all females. We don't fully know their breeding habits and time or length of gestation. We'll have to calculate how long until they mate, give birth, and then be able to reproduce again. This is a rare spider from a part of the world with a considerably low population. We have to learn a whole lot more. We've got to get busy now before we let them get busy. Dr. Monroe met with the financial board and fellow scientists 2 days later. He shared his findings with them, and the questions began to fire at him like an AK-47 assault rifle. Well, now I've got a question. Can we replace human bone with the new synthetic bone? A fast yes was all Dr. Monroe spit out. The questions continued. Is it a bone clone? The doctor chuckled. Bone clone. It's a synthetic bone, a combination of ground-up glass called silica, along with the spider silk from this particular spider webbing. Actually, original human bone is not used in creating it, so no, it's not a bone clone, but I like the sound of that. Let me also say that we're not sure how the spider produces the correct amount of material needed for the mixture to make or fabricate healthy bones, but we've confirmed that it does. Only this one species of spiders produce the silk needed. The next question was the one the doctor was waiting for, and he could not wait to answer. So, Dr. Monroe, is it possible to replace human bone that is overtaken by cancer? Yes, yes, ha ha! He laughed vigorously. He couldn't contain it any longer as he explained further. Not only that, but we can take on spinal issues. Let's say a patient who has their backbone destroyed. Those who experienced paralysis, we can completely rebuild their vertebrae. There may be other complications for them regarding nerve damage, but from an orthopedic standpoint, we have high hopes to not only provide better bones for hip and knee replacements, but possibly help paraplegics or quadriplegics. Those that are subject to weak bones or even death caused from complications in human bone substance, such as bone cancer, their lives could be saved. We could even provide better prosthetics for amputees. The human body will not react adversely to this new material. It is as close to human bone as possible, not metallic or plastic. He leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. The people at the table in front of him all smiled. One of them broke the brief silence. Money well spent. Another said, "You did it, Dr. Monroe." He corrected them. "We did it." He nodded to his staff. They all laughed with confidence and gave a sigh of relief. One of the other scientists on the board spoke up. "Now, we're ready to proceed with phase 2. Dr. Monroe raised a hand, slowing them down. Whoa, wait. I do have some concerns. We'd like to move into phase 2. However, upon my better judgment, my fellow scientists and I fear that if we breed the gray-black spider in captivity, we could end up with an overpopulation of them. In the wild, they're able to distance themselves, but in captivity, well, they may not have the capacity to show restraint." One board member said, "You think they won't breed?" Dr. Monroe said, "No, they may breed too much, too often. Also, the evidence of their bite is inconclusive." Unless we contain the spider and keep them in captivity, they could very well overrun the population of the entire world. Aren't you being a little overdramatic, Dr. Monroe? One of the board members questioned. Rather than letting Dr. Monroe answer what was directed to him, one of the board members, who was a doctor of medicine, replied, "There are no risks. The gray-black spider breeds in the wild regularly, and there's no evidence of danger to their bite that we know of." "Well then, let's proceed," suggested yet another board member. Dr. Monroe stepped in again. "Wait, seriously, I don't think we should rush into this. We don't know all the ramifications and repercussions. I'd like to get a specialist's opinion. A few more tests have to be done." One of the fat, pompous men slammed his fists on the table and insisted, "No more! No more testing! You are a specialist. Let's get on with this." Dr. Monroe shook his head. "I mean a specialist in the field of spiders. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't know enough about this spider. Yes, its web is useful and can be used to literally create miracles, but we don't know. If we don't observe the specimen and allow controlled breeding at a slow pace, we may very well mess up an entire ecosystem and lose what balance we have. I suggest you allow me to contact an acrinologist, one who studies spiders and other acrinoids." I'm probably saying that wrong. "At the very least, we should only work with the few that we have, but don't rush into urgently force breeding them until we know more." It was as if the doctor hadn't even spoken. What he said fell on deaf ears. The board president stood. "It's decided then. Let's proceed." Then he looked and gestured toward Dr. Monroe and finished with, "Under the controlled environment and supervision of Dr. Monroe and his team, meeting adjourned." Even before a single man left the room, unknown to everyone there, a few of the scientist students had already took it upon themselves to begin the breeding process. Steve had convinced Jill, another one of Dr. Monroe's assistants and Steve's girlfriend, to be a little overzealous. They had put 2 gray-black spiders in one container, rather than keeping them separate as they were instructed to do. They had no idea how quickly they reproduced when in a contained area. That night, Dr. Monroe contacted Anne McIntyre, a personal friend who had dedicated her life to acrinology, the study of spiders. She was very active in the scientific community that studied spiders and related animals such as scorpions and pseudoscorpions, collectively called arachnids. He knew she would be very familiar with the spider Dr. Monroe was using. She opened several windows on her computer screen, a few books, and even some term papers she had written that were published in various medical and scientific journals as she spoke. "I will try to carry on a conversation with you without going off the subject, old friend," Dr. Monroe lightly argued. "I'm still younger than you." Anne smiled. "Not by much. Besides, I look better." Monroe agreed to that, then promised, "I'll take you out for dinner on a personal level soon. For now, I have got to find out more about the personal life and habits of this spider." She continued, "The gray-black spider you were working with is actually called... Wait, let me send you a picture." She shot the picture through cyberspace to her friend. Got a picture here. I'll show that. Oh, I don't know if you can see it. I don't know if you can see it. There it is. Dr. Monroe jumped as the massive image appeared on his screen. He continued, "Yep, that's it," and gave him the scientific name for which the doctor had assigned a specific scientific subject number to, 774.337, and simplified even further by calling it the gray and black one. Anne shared her expertise. Technically, it is called the Minimuris bivitatus, the gray wall jumping, the gray wall jumping spider. Monroe shivered. He was used to working with them, but they were always behind a glass, and there was never more than one at a time. They never put two of any together. He had taught his students and assistants that joining even two could complicate their studies because one may eat the other, or they may reproduce, and the original specimen may change after giving birth. He listened to everything Anne had to say as she enhanced what little he knew in this particular area. The gray wall jumper is a hunting spider that does not spin a web for prey capture. However, they do use silk for drag lines and constructing egg sacs and retreats. It was actually heading down the road to extinction, much like the honeybee. They are able to reproduce quickly, but in nature, they were spread out geographically. We're not sure how they traveled, but it's a good thing they did, because they could have taken over a small island if they remained in one contained area. Dr. Monroe said, "That's my concern. Tell me more." Anne continued, "This is fascinating. It only takes these little guys or girls just one day between having their eggs fertilized and then birth, hatching the very next day." Monroe expressed his amazement. "Oh my!" Anne was gushing with excitement. "You think that is amazing? The newborns are ready to mate and conceive just 2 days after they are born." Monroe had to question her facts. "The offspring, the babies, are ready to do it at 2 days old?" Anne smiled. "Not only do it, but can get pregnant." Dr. Monroe thought about the scientist who studied and observed this whole process and tediously took notes. Just when he thought it couldn't get any more extraordinary, he asked for Anne to confirm something. "So, Anne, then those babies give birth to babies in just 1 day?" She replied, "Yep." The doctor asked, "How many can they have at one time?" Anne asked him to guess. Monroe didn't feel like they needed to rush the conversation, so he played along in the guessing game and said, "Well, I had a cat that gave birth to a litter of 4. Anne laughed. "Ha ha! Mittens! I remember her." "No, think more along the lines of hamsters or your lab rats." Monroe said, "Oh, my word, 14 to 16 at a time?" "More," Anne quizzed him. Dr. Monroe shot higher. 20? Anne asked him if he was sitting down and ready for the answer, then said 30 to 50. "At once?" Monroe was floored. "Yep," and proceeded to share the information that was gathered about the species. "You won't have any trouble breeding them, especially in a small, controlled environment. To be honest, their extinction may not have been a bad thing. They were primarily found in unpopulated and very low populated areas of the world. Their bite is deadly. Just 72 hours after they've injected their poison, the victim dies." Dr. Monroe shared with Anne how they have determined that this is the only spider they have whose silk has the right properties needed to make the new bone marrow. He also shared how he was glad he had not given his assistants the green light to start breeding them, and added, "It is hard to indicate the males from the females, but that is not even necessary." Monroe said, "What? Why? Don't tell me they can have same-sex relations and still reproduce." And clarified, "They are asexual. If you put two males together, one of them has the ability to change its sex and become a female, thus being ready, able, and willing to become a mommy." "What?" Anne spoke calmly. "You know there are species that are able to do that. Well, think of it this way. You'll have plenty of them to make the webbing you need to mass produce this synthetic bone. You're going to make a fortune." The doctor thought to himself, "Yeah, but at what price?" He thanked Anne again for her time and for sharing her research, and said, "Yeah, these little guys and girls will produce a lot of helpful silk, but it sounds like they will be producing too much if we are not careful." The next morning, upon returning to the lab, Dr. Monroe opened the thick steel door and was horrified by what he saw. The entire room was overtaken completely with cobwebs. They were so thick he could barely see through them. He looked down, and there, tangled in the web, near the door, was Steve, the young student who thought he would make history by breeding them prematurely. He was mumbling. He was alive, but rendered helpless. Dr. Monroe reached down to help free him. He tried to rip the webbing from his mouth, but it would not tear. All he could do is stretch it. Once his mouth was freed, Steve shouted, "Watch out! They come at you from the sides!" Dr. Monroe witnessed what Steve said firsthand, but insisted, "I've got to free you." "No, Dr. Monroe, I brought this on." The doctor ignored Steve's crying. He didn't want to increase the young man's panic with the information Anne had shared, but knew if he didn't push back the webbing, the spiders could very well be planting their eggs. He used his feet while tugging on Steve's arms, shoulders, then upper body. He paid no mind to the spiders approaching him on both sides. Dr. Monroe stood and finished pulling Steve out and under his legs. Steve jumped to his feet and reached for the doctor. The spider reached his legs. One was crawling up the center, while the other two raised to their back legs on each side. Monroe thought about their nickname, wall jumpers, as they shot across and around his legs. They were trading places and quickly surrounding him while binding him from his legs up. Steve yelled, "No!" His impulse was to jump back as the spiders worked meticulously, intricately, and with extreme precision. If Steve had not instinctively jumped back, he would have risked being bit and caught in their webbing again. Jill, another student and Steve's girlfriend, entered the room. She screamed immediately. She couldn't find any words except to shrill, "Ah!" Her mentor, the doctor, was now encased completely by the spider web. Steve tackled Jill to the ground away from the danger. There was nothing they could do but watch as the gray-black spiders reached the doctor's head. They crawled all over his face, not spinning any more web than what was needed to hold him still. A third, larger one made its way up the front center of Dr. Monroe's body. The other two seemed to be trolling around his face, waiting for a command on what to do next. Jill asked, "Do they bite?" Steve said, "They didn't bite me. I didn't feel a thing." Dr. Monroe had no choice but to remain completely still. He closed his eyes, wrinkled his forehead, and was sweating profusely as the large one came right up the center of his face. When it reached the very top of the doctor's head, it spread out flat. The center of its body touched his head, and her legs spread out on each side. She raised up and down on his head, as if she was trying to suck out his brains or maybe even lay an egg. She turned to each side as if dismissing the other two. They followed her as she moved back down and away from the body. The side spiders slit the webs that they wove as they descended, freeing Dr. Monroe. Once free, he stepped back and stammered to the door. Steve and Jill trying to gather themselves. "Did you see that?" Steve asked rhetorically. The doctors came out with, "No, I didn't see a thing." Jill said, "How can you joke during a time like this?" The doctor answered, "Because I'm still alive." "They didn't want to bite you or eat you?" noted Steve. The doctor took a step further. "They didn't even want to keep me." Steve's face became pale. Is that what they were doing to me?" "I think so. Nesting grounds, or maybe they only eat or keep fresh young meat, not old men." Dr. Monroe wasn't much older, but he felt that way because of the years of experience. Jill asked, "Can they get out of here? The lab, I mean." The doctor answered, "Not if we secure them correctly. They can't get out of here unless they already have." Jill scoffed. "Well, what?" Steve asked. "You think some got out?" The doctor could only shrug his shoulders with uncertainty of how to answer that question. The three of them worked for hours catching them, putting them away in individual containers this time before leaving. However, unknown to them, some were still incubating. Dr. Monroe shared the knowledge Anne shared with him about how these spiders were asexual, so it was inevitable that they would reproduce, no matter if there were just two of either sex together. He also informed his assistants about the speed of their birthing being faster than any animal or insect he had ever heard of. Dr. Monroe's worst nightmare and predictions was actually coming true. As they worked, Dr. Monroe assured them, as well as himself, that this would all be worth their efforts. He reminded them, "These are the only spiders that produce the needed compound to form bones used to replace amputee bones. Actual new bones to replace cancerous bones, as well as broken legs, arms, ribs." Dr. Monroe repeated what he knew in an attempt to squash what they didn't about the whole project. He continued with, "So, as unruly as they can be, it's important we don't kill any of these spiders." Monroe also secretively hoped that no humans would be killed in the process. That night was when Steve was bit in the theater. The spiders didn't bite Steve in the lab, but used him as a mode of transportation by laying their eggs so their species could escape. Now, just 72 hours from the point of Steve being bit, Jill was sitting by his side as he lay dying in his own bed. Steve and Jill knew what was causing Steve's death: the bite of the gray and black spider. They dared not go to the general hospital in fear that they would cause a worldwide panic. They felt personally responsible for the whole thing because they bred them without their boss's permission and prior approval. Dr. Monroe was working with Anne, trying different serums to heal this young college student. He forgave Steve for jumping the gun. After all, they were also friends. He remembered when Steve attempted to pull him out of the spider's trap and clutches, risking his own life. Although Dr. Monroe and Anne were the best scientists in their field who could possibly find a cure, and in spite of them trying for almost 24 hours to save Steve, they came up with nothing. Exasperated, they finally left Jill and Steve alone. As Dr. Monroe walked Anne to her car out front, she expressed, "I feel so bad for the young man. I know this is no time to make personal plans, but don't forget, you still owe me dinner." Monroe was glad she was trying to lighten up the mood and assured her, "I wouldn't miss dinner with you for almost anything." She nodded in understanding, then he said, "Except maybe the end of the world." He wept, and they held each other. Anne then assured him, "We'll figure all this out. It's not too late." But it's too late for Steve. They embraced again and tried to comfort one another. Jill was by Steve as he was taking his last breath, but before he died, he saw Jill's eyes get big. She wasn't looking at Steve, but at his shoulder, the same side he had been bitten on. It was a gray and black spider crawling out of Steve. It crawled up and over him. Everything appeared to be in slow motion. It was as if the spider looked Jill in the eye. All at once, two spiders leapt at Jill from the sides. She screamed and tried to dodge the insects, but no human reflex was fast enough. The spiders began to spew their webs around Jill's ankles. Still, Steve watched helplessly as the two spun around the opposite way of each other. After securing her legs, they moved quickly up to her arms. This attack was just like what Steve and Dr. Monroe encountered. Steve spoke to Jill the best he could. "Honey, they don't bite," she said. "They bit you," he reminded her. Not during this part." She quivered. But we don't know, Steve. Are they laying eggs in me right now, or what?" He begged her to try to calm herself and not make any sudden movements. Soon she couldn't move. She was completely immobilized by their webs. "Don't scream," said Steve as Jill tried telling herself the same thing. The third spider crawled up Jill's body from her toe to her thighs to her abdomen to her breast, and it stopped there. Jill was rendered helpless, wrapped like a mummy. Her heart raced. Steve watched as the spider flattened itself on Jill's chest, exactly like it did on Dr. Monroe's head. He and Jill were thankful it wasn't on her face. After a few seconds, the spider gave its direction to the other two, and they began to descend from Jill, once again splitting the tight cocoon of webbing that held her captive. Just as fast as they appeared, they disappeared, and Jill was free. Steve felt victorious. Now, Jill knew what it meant to have a near-death experience. As Jill took her first sigh of relief, Steve took his last breath. Dr. Monroe finally re-entered the house, then Steve's room, just as Jill's body slumped over Steve. Monroe's words were a blur to her. He's finally set free from the pain and anguish. Jill snapped out of her grief long enough to yell a warning to the doctor. They're here! He didn't care. His heart and mind were focused on Jill's life and Steve's premature death. After they felt like they had properly grieved over Steve, they quickly became the hunters now, as they searched the room for the spiders. Jill explained how it came out of Steve. Dr. Monroe suggested, perhaps they've gone back in him. We'll have to monitor his body and check the morgue. Jill, you shower extra good. She said, I'll do more than shower. I'll shave my whole body. He wanted to tell her she didn't need to go to that extreme, but he honestly didn't know. Later that night, Jill was at Dr. Monroe's house. She didn't want to be alone and didn't know if she was safe anywhere else. He had his own lab there as well. He asked Anne to come help him run some more tests and trials on the spider to try to find out any and everything possible about them that was still unknown, in hopes that they could stop them. Jill was sobbing. Why did it take Steve but not me? Monroe took a moment away from their research to remind her, Jill, they didn't take me either. They didn't want us. But what was so different? That's what I will find out, he promised. They both raised their drinks as Dr. Monroe said, 2 and 4, Steve. Their glasses clinked together. Anne came over to join them with an empty syringe. I need to take your blood and examine you both to see if... She hated to finish her reason. To see if any eggs were laid. They nodded and found themselves between hoping she'd find something and hoping she'd find nothing at all. Either way, it had to be done. Anne also informed them, I'm going to contact Dr. Chad Aver. Monroe assured Jill, he's another long-time friend. He's in the medical field. Between the 3 of us, 4 counting you, we'll figure out what to do.